Oftentimes the word argument has a negative connotation associated with it. Arguments are viewed as emotionally charged experiences that can be very negative for some individuals. In some religious and ethnic cultures, arguing is discouraged and viewed as a bad behavior. However, arguments can also be very powerful tools to help persuade and inform individuals regarding a vast array of topics and issues. Arguments appear in all forms of media, from TV commercials to trying to persuade us to buy a particular type of toothpaste, to a newspaper editorial arguing for a particular political view, and arguments are everywhere. It's essential to keep in mind that there are good arguments and bad arguments. As a reader, it's vital to be able to analyze and determine if a written argument is good or if it's bad. In this particular video, we're going to focus on what to look for in an argument and how to tell the difference between a good and a bad argument. We'll be discussing bad arguments or fallacies in a different video. Basic arguments will typically have three components. They'll have a main point, often called a claim. There'll be evidence supporting that claim, and an explanation of how the evidence supports the claim, which we would call a warrant or explanation. The claim or main point of an argument is basically the main idea of the passage. To find out what it is we use the same process we would use when looking for a main idea of a particular passage. We would typically identify the topic of the passage and try to determine the author's point of view. Just as a reminder, point of view can be determined by looking at the tone the author is using towards the subject and also trying to establish the purpose that the author had for writing the selection. If you don't fully understand what to do to figure out the tone and purpose, I would encourage you to go back and review those videos along with also the video related to identifying main idea. Another important factor to take into consideration when identifying the claim is being able to identify the text pattern or structure that the author is using. Typically, in a written argument, the author will use one of the following patterns: statement and support, problem solution, comparison, or cause and effect. Understanding the pattern that the author is using will help you know what type of evidence that you're looking for and make finding evidence easier. If the pattern or patterns are unfamiliar to you, again, I would encourage you to go back and watch the video related to text patterns. Let's practice finding a claim for an argument using the topic, point of view, and text pattern in a passage. So go ahead and pause the video and take a moment to read through this letter to a school board. While you're reading, look for the topic, the author's point of view, the tone and purpose, and also see if you can identify the pattern or a pattern that the author might be using in this particular text. All right, let's go through the article and see if we can identify the claim the author is making. We're immediately drawn to the topic of the letter, which is basically about school uniforms. Let's take a look at the purpose and tone of the writing. I like to look at the tone first. When I was reading, I noticed words like concerned, against, duty, support, afraid, implore, represent, elected officials, etc. Thinking about these words, I tried to come up with one word that expressed the overall tone of the author. To me, it felt like the tone the author was trying to use in this particular passage was that of concerned or worried, a worried tone. And I got that from looking at all of those words and kind of getting that there's this appeal that don't make this choice based upon what you have kind of a thing. So as I read, I noticed that the author used several different patterns. So in addition to the tone, I kind of noticed that there was this pattern. There were a couple different patterns. There was kind of a comparative pattern, but the one that really kind of stuck out to me was the problem solution approach that the author used. So the author is putting forth this problem. You don't have enough data to make a decision, and then the author gives us a solution, which is you can do this, this, and this to get more information. So I really liked kind of how that author set that particular up, and it seemed to me to be kind of the main pattern or structure that the author was using in their letter. So I basically have concluded, based upon the tone, the topic, the structure, that the claim the author is making is that before the school board makes a decision with regards to school uniforms, they need to seek additional data. And so that is the claim that I feel that the author is making. So when I read analytically arguments or anything, I like to use graphic organizers. And the graphic organizer that I like to use when I'm working with an argument is basically on a piece of paper. I draw my graphic organizer, which is a triangle. This allows me to keep my thoughts organized so that during a class discussion or when I'm asked to write about the argument that I've read about, I can easily look at my graphic organizer and keep everything in order and nicely organized and be able to recall the information of the argument rather easily. So like I said, I like to use a triangle, and at the top of my triangle is where I put my claim. It's at the top because in order to be a good and valid argument, it must have support underneath it. Otherwise, it collapses. That's how I kind of visually remember an argument. So in our example, I would write at the top of my triangle the claim, which would be that more data is needed before a decision on uniforms could be made. Now we need to find evidence to support this claim from the text. So what is supporting evidence? And so supporting evidence is basically critical in evaluating an argument, specifically to make sure that the argument is logical and sound. So there's basically three things that we look for when we're looking for pieces of evidence to support a claim. The first thing that we're looking for is what we would say called relevance. Is the actual evidence relevant to the claim that's being made? So if I'm making an argument about why we should go to the moon, I wouldn't want to have a piece of evidence about global warming that isn't related to going to the moon. So relevance means that the information is associated with that particular claim. Then sufficient means, is there enough evidence to persuade me, to actually help me come to that conclusion? Having one piece of evidence is pretty weak. Having two pieces is stronger, three pieces is even more stronger. So is there enough evidence, enough support to warrant the claim? And then the last component is credibility. So is the evidence being used credible? Is this just an opinion or is this factual? Now, evidence oftentimes will take on very specific forms. So when you're dealing with credibility, if someone's opinion is in there, well, that I guess is a piece of evidence, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't have a very strong sense of credibility. Whereas if I have a statistics from a survey that was used, that's more credible just because it's a group of people that have come together to fill out information, and you're getting trends based upon that rather than just a single opinion. So evidence will often take the form of examples that the author may give, like specific examples of something, reasons, just opinions or facts, or statistics might be another thing that an author might use to support a claim. So let's take another look at our article about uniforms and needing more data. Think about what evidence is in the text. I do this by asking the following question. What reason does the author give that support their claim or their argument? So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can locate evidence to support the author's claim that more evidence or more data is needed before a decision can be made. For me, there are two things that stick out as reasons that there's need for more data. The first is that there were 8 people at the meeting about school uniforms. That was it. There's just 8 people. 6 of them didn't want uniforms, 8 of them were there, 2 of them did. To me, that's a good reason to get more data. There's only 8 people that the board is basing this decision on. The other reason is an anecdotal statistic that the author gave, which was basically she went out and visited 46 families in her neighborhood, and the majority of them, all but 2 of them, were supporting the school uniforms. So it kind of is like, oh, that's an interesting piece of evidence that supports that data. And the reason why I think it's an interesting piece is it seems to contradict what was being said before. So those are kind of my 2 pieces of evidence. So I go back into my pyramid, and on my pyramid, in the slots that I have down below, as you can see right here, evidence, I write only 8 parents were at the meeting. That's one piece of my evidence. And then the second piece of evidence was 42 parents have expressed support. So both of those kind of support that claim that the author is making. The last component of the argument is the connection between the evidence and the claim. This is what we would call a warrant. This is the tape that holds that argument together. Sometimes the author will directly tell you how the evidence is related to the claim. Other times the author leaves that up to the reader to make that inference or connection for themselves. So it's an important step that you go through in connecting the evidence to the main claim. So to do that, let's go back to my graphic organizer. So on my graphic organizer, I typically make my connections for each piece of evidence right next to it. I think to myself, how does this support or strengthen the claim? So let's look at the first piece of evidence that we have. There were only 8 people at the meeting. So how does this relate to the claim? So let's go back and look at the text. The author makes the connection between this piece of evidence by showing the logic that making a decision based upon so few could actually be inaccurate. And she does that very well in the very last sentence of the first paragraph, where she says, "I'm afraid that you'll make a decision based upon the voice of a few individuals rather than solid evidence of the majority." I really like that piece of evidence. So I go over to my graphic organizer, and I'm going to record my connections next to the piece of evidence. If I have my own thoughts, I'll also record those there. So here I would record that direct quote from that text. That's the connection for this piece of evidence to my claim. And then I also had this my own thought, which was my connection was there's only 8 people. Is that really enough people to make a good decision? And then I repeat the process with the second piece of evidence. And so I just pulled this from the text here where I kind of summarize. There appears to be a silent majority of parents, but it needs to be confirmed, meaning that there were, more parents out there that were saying they wanted the program than were at that meeting. So the last thing that I do is I make sure that the whole argument makes sense. This is the logic test of the process. So to do this, I'm basically checking to see if the evidence is relevant and sufficient and credible to support the claim, and does the whole thing make sense? I start by looking at the claim and asking myself, so why do I need more data? So what proof do I have that I need more data? And then I go to my first piece of evidence. There were only 8 people at the meeting. So what logically does that say? You need more evidence because you can't base a decision upon what 8 people say. Then I look at my second piece of evidence. Does this logically make sense? Well, it appears that there's 44 parents out there that think that they should have school uniforms, which is contrasting this first piece of evidence. So that tells me that there's an inconsistency and I should seek more information before making a decision. So to me, both pieces of evidence make sense and support the claim. So a good argument will have a claim, supporting evidence, and warrants that connect the evidence together. If an argument is missing any of these components, it would be a bad argument. Bad arguments or fallacies attempt to make an argument, but there's a flaw in one of these aspects of the argument. In our next video or in another video, we'll be talking about those fallacies. So until that time, have some fun in identifying arguments.